The second person I've ever known in my life that had that combination of licensures. Mr. LeMasters has joined us, and he's going to give us his bio is on the very back page of the materials. If you flip all the way to the back page, you can see his impressive bio as an attorney and an expert in funerals and embalming. And he works directly with practitioners, businesses, and serves as counsel for associations, including the National Concrete Burial Association, the Catholic Cemeteries Conference, and general counsel for the International Cemetery Cremation and Funeral Association. So, and he's going to give us a presentation today on cemetery association governance and financing. There are some pockets in West Virginia, as we understand it, where there are issues and litigation and complications. So let's welcome, please, Paul Masters. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Appreciate it.
And the floor is yours, sir.
If you don't mind, I'm going to stand up. Hopefully you can hear me. It's not too big of a room. Yeah, thanks for having me. And I want to talk about preserving our cemeteries. It's an interesting dynamic going on across the country in a lot of respects. So here's a question I get, and this is literally a phone call I will get. Paul, where do I turn my keys in? And this is from cemetery owners. Now, I was going to tell you a story. I'm going to try to see if this works. Technology. I sent this in, so hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
Hi, Paul. This is not an emergency or anything, but your name was given to me. I'm a board member of a local cemetery, and we are, like most cemeteries, facing financial problems, and thought I would like to talk to you for a moment about our situation. My number is I'll be traveling in the next 10 days, but I should be reachable at that number if I'm not actually on an airplane or in the water. So I hope you can call us back. We need some help. Thanks. Bye.
Ironically, I got that phone call last week while I was preparing for this. And I get that call frequently. And we're at a point where there are more and more cemeteries across the country that just can't go on. They're done. And there are different reasons of that happening. One, obviously, is money. People don't realize it, but cemeteries can run out of money. We're going to talk about the basics, about endowment care, perpetual care, and everybody thinks, oh, there's money in the bank, it'll take care of us. I don't know if anybody has money in the bank. It may not be providing you everything you want right now, so that is not a thing. We also have cases across America, sadly, where money is taken from cemeteries, so they are in ill repute. Another thing that happens, cemeteries, they are finite in space. They have so much inventory. Once all the spots are full, they're done. But sometimes cemeteries aren't all filled up. They're just in areas that people don't want to go to anymore. That could be because it's out in private land. It could be because it's too far from the city. It could be because it's too far in the city. But people just don't go there anymore, even though there is space available. But that inventory becomes an issue. And then lastly, and one of the reasons we're here is damage. Now, obviously, either one of those, money can be damaging and inventory can be a damage, but then there is literally physical damage to a cemetery, that it can be just in disrepair, overgrown, neglect. A lot of things can happen, natural disaster, and they can become so damaged that they are out of use anymore. And the question becomes after that is, now what? Who's going to take over this cemetery? Who's responsible? What laws and regulations are in place, and who's going to step up to do anything? So that's kind of the gist today. Here's how I thought we'd start off. I don't know how many of you are deeply rooted in knowing everything about cemeteries. Normally, I find not. I have a very odd background, so I was going to share some basics about cemeteries in general, and then we'll break it down by some other states so you can kind of see what's happening out there nearby. This is where I also put in a disclosure. So I do a lot of training and public speaking across America, and I have several disclosures. I'm only going to use one for you, and that is I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. Meaning I do know some law, I know some legal stuff, but I'm not here as an attorney for every state. I am licensed in several, but this is just a 30,000-foot view. We could spend an entire day. I actually train and do a cemetery operations that's an all-day program. I don't think you want to be here all day talking about cemeteries. So I'm going to give you the basics, high level, but questions, shout them out. I'm here for you all, so whatever you want to know, I'll share what I know. Just a real quick snippet about my background. I am an attorney. I am a funeral director and embalmer, and I've kind of created this niche business of death care. So I work with funeral homes and cemeteries and crematories all over North America, actually, Canada, U.S., and so I specialize in this kind of very odd area. It doesn't mean I know it all. It just means I see a lot of stuff. And so thanks for having me to share what I know about this. Very big overview of cemeteries. These are kind of some of the terms and things that you need to understand when you're talking about cemeteries in your state. One, we have classifications of profit versus nonprofit. What's always interesting to me is there are a lot of nonprofit cemeteries that are ran by big companies. And so nonprofit doesn't mean, and I know you all probably know this, nonprofit doesn't mean that nobody makes any money. It's just a classification. And there is a cemetery classification by the IRS called a 501c13 that gives them some special provisions under tax code, one of which is they normally don't have to pay any property tax. So I share that just so you understand it. Just because it's a nonprofit cemetery, it does not necessarily mean it's not governed or regulated. Now you get into the next big category, though, that you have to be aware of, and that is there are a lot of exempt cemeteries across the country. Typically, these run under, the big ones are state or municipality cemeteries, and then also religious cemeteries. Those are typically always exempt. What I mean by that is when they're exempt, it means they don't have to follow any of the regulations. Now, most of them choose to run and follow. I'll give you an example. I actually work with I serve as counsel for the Catholic Cemetery Conference. So they have oversight over all of the Catholic cemeteries, basically, in the U.S. And one of the things I find with Catholic cemeteries, even though they're exempt in almost every state, they still choose to follow some of the general principles of things like perpetual care and merchandise trust funds. Those are the next big things to understand. Perpetual, sometimes called endowment care trust funds, these are kind of the backbones of a cemetery, meaning this is the money that gets set aside that is supposed to maintain the cemetery in perpetuity. Again, we could spend a lot of time on this. There are a lot of misunderstandings about this, one of which is a lot of consumers believe that it takes care of everything, including when a marker or monument gets damaged or destroyed. They say, hey, I paid into that perpetual care thing. You go fix it. Markers, caskets, monuments, those are not cemetery property. Those are consumer property. And one of the things, and we'll talk about this today, is when there's damage that's done to a cemetery, depending on what's done, it may fall on the consumer to take care of it. One of the worst cases I dealt with was a horrible theft at a cemetery of all the bronze urns that it had in a niche back when everybody wanted to sell precious metals. So somebody went in, stole all of the bronze urns, left the ashes behind. So I guess that was sort of good. I don't know. It was still tragic. But when they wanted to go after the cemetery was actually kind of not responsible. I say not kind of, but they ultimately stepped up because it wasn't their property. That was consumer property. And that runs into a whole thing about what you can insure and not insure. So anyway, but that perpetual endowment care is typically money that is set aside every time you sell a grave space. Part of that money has to go into endowment care. The other part of that is the cemeteries typically can never touch the corpus or the main part of that money. They have to live off of the interest. And as we know, interest is not exactly booming right now in investments. So cemeteries are very limited a lot of times in what they have available. Last piece, just so we understand it, is what's called the merchandise or pre-need trust fund that cemeteries typically have. So these are things that they would sell ahead of time, like maybe a marker they would pre-sell, or they would sell maybe an opening and closing. Most states require that those things that are prepaid on it, so again, before we actually ever need it, those also have to go into a trust. Now that money, the cemeteries actually can get at the time of death. So just to put West Virginia in this whole group of everything, this is where West Virginia falls on all those basics. One, you absolutely have cemeteries defined. You have a cemetery company. Basically, any ground that is devoted to the burial, whether it's private or public, is a cemetery. And the cemetery company is that association or company that runs it. You also have exemptions. So in your West Virginia, in your regs, anything that's private or family, so on private ground, family ground, those are exempt from regulations, meaning I could put a cemetery on my farm and I don't have to do any perpetual care. I don't have to pre-need anything. I can do kind of what I want. County, municipal, all exempt. Church, exempt. And then you have a carve out for nonprofit. Again, it's not like pure nonprofit because there are many nonprofits. But if it's a true nonprofit where nobody, basically everything goes back into the cemetery, they're exempt as well. None of this is unlike other states, but that's where you are. Your pre-need trust, you do have regulation over that. 40% of the sale price has to go into a trust fund. And then you have a permanent endowment care fund. $10 per grave space or 10%. The larger amount has to go in. So if I sell a grave space, for $1,000, then 10%, $100. I try to pick easy math while I'm talking, so just making up numbers. So that's kind of where West Virginia lives in oversight as far as regulations. But let's talk about the damage side of it. So when states are looking at how they're going to handle a cemetery, if they're ever going to, I'll say, take it over or provide funding or help, the words that we typically see in laws are things like abandonment, disrepair, neglect. There's an article that was written by the USA Today, and the article, if you want to look it up at some point in your leisure, it's back in 2023, and it was called "When the Dead Don't Stay Buried." And actually, I talked to USA Today. They had called and said, "Hey, can you give us any information?" What it had to deal with is cemeteries and climate change. And this idea of, more and more floods, all of this information, these, what is it, 100-year storms that, now we get every summer, right? Anyway, I didn't make the cut for my quote in the USA Today, only because they wanted to know what are all the laws out there that help on this. They said there really aren't any. And that's one of the issues is most of the laws specifically talk about things like abandoned cemeteries. So cemetery that everybody just walks away from it. They talk about disrepair. So cemeteries that have maybe still functioning, but they're just, they're completely unmowed, unkept, could be on private land, could be on public land. And then neglect. Disrepair and neglect obviously are very similar, but I look at neglect as more of a monetary issue. So this is more of an internal, operational, bad scenario. And we have all those. Damage itself, though, what is not out there in a lot of laws is what happens if a cemetery gets destroyed, one of the, by natural disaster, anything like that, storm. Most states don't have provisions for that. And I'll talk about why as we go through these. So saying all that, here's my thought. if you look at state laws, there's three big categories that I kind of see that how they handle this. One, typically a state will define a reason or basis that the state or locality or however could come in to take over. Then they talk about typically who has that ability, again, to take over or help. And then lastly, who's responsible after the takeover. And again, I think this is probably the best way. I'm going to go through, I'll call it some neighboring states, just to give you, because what I can tell you is in West Virginia, there's really nothing carved out on any of these right now. And I think that's why, you want to hear about this, is how do other states handle it. So these are in no particular order, although I do live in Ohio, so I deal with this one more often, so I put it first. But Ohio, they do have a couple provisions in the code that cover this. What they talk about are abandoned cemeteries. So these are cemeteries that have become detrimental to public welfare. Now, what I can tell you is it's broadly interpreted. So when it's abandoned or detrimental, that means running out of money is one of the other ways they do it. How this gets enforced is a trustee, so the people that run the cemetery can basically say, here's the keys, we're done, and then the township shall accept. Let me tell you how that works. They don't want it. Like, the fight is not the trustee saying, hey, we want out. The fight is telling the township that they now are the proud owner of the cemetery. It does not go well. Typically in these localities, I can tell you, and we'll talk about some of those other laws, the first thing they'll say is, oh, that's not in our township. That's somewhere else. It's right on the edge. We only have part of it. And I get it. If you've never run a cemetery, you don't want to run a cemetery. It's unending. That's the thing about a cemetery. We talk about these perpetual care funds to last in perpetuity forever, because that's how long cemeteries are supposed to last. And the problem is that I had to testify one time in a case because somebody was claiming the cemetery had too much money in their perpetual care fund. They were too rich. And they asked me, I said, well, how much money should a trust fund have? I said, there's not enough, because arguably that cemetery has to last forever. How will you ever have enough money? Because there's a point that every cemetery will run out of space, run out of a use. And at that point, all you're doing is depleting the funds. And so anyway, that's how this goes. The other thing that's not on here that I will mention about Ohio, and I'll mention it for each state, Ohio has a couple of things. One, they are regulated under the Department of Real Estate. Now, there's a few states that actually have cemeteries under the Department of Real Estate. It's an odd thing, I think, for most people, but the rationale, if you go back in time, is, cemeteries are land. Land is real estate, so yeah, this all makes sense. The problem is it creates a lot of issues, because consumers believe when they obtain a burial right that they own the land. And what makes it even worse is historically cemeteries have used things like deeds to transfer a plot of cemetery. And that isn't what they get. You get a burial right. So consumers only have a right to be buried. They actually don't own that land. And it's a lot of confusion. So while this is how it's set up here, it's probably not the greatest thing, but the other thing Ohio has is what's called the Ohio Cemetery Dispute Resolution. Not all states have this, but it's kind of a nice little trigger. They actually can help resolve issues. I can tell you I've actually used the dispute resolution to help teach a township of their new responsibility, which is a lot of fun. It's not fun, but you get the idea. So that's where we are in Ohio. If you want to go to Kentucky, this is their version. They look at anything that is abandoned, and then the land is needed for public purpose. One of the things in Kentucky is it's not easy to switch over. The city attorney is the only one who can file suit to do this. So unless you can, unlike Ohio, there's this dichotomy, right? In Ohio, the trustees say, hey, look, we have no money, we can't take care of it anymore, we're done, it's yours. Here, the city has to say, hey, we actually would like to take this over and fight for it, which does not happen very often. So this doesn't really protect too much as far as the longevity of the cemetery. The other thing is when this happens, title goes to the cemetery, which again, a lot of times they don't want. And the other thing is this is specific, it's written for the city. So we, as you probably all understand, there isn't a city everywhere. So anywhere where there's an outlying, it's almost impossible to get anything for a cemetery in Kentucky. I will also tell you, Kentucky, everything runs through the Attorney General's office. They have no regulatory oversight. So everything goes through the AG's office. As a matter of fact, if you buy or sell a cemetery, which I help people do all over the place, that application, that process goes through the AG's office for them to approve it. Pennsylvania, they have a brand new provision, 1923. It's not nearly brand new, but they're sticking with it. And theirs is interesting as well. Again, they go by neglected, and then if it's a nuisance. Interesting here is citizens can bring this. So if you live within a 5-mile radius and there's a cemetery in that 5-mile radius that is basically in bad shape for any reason, neglected, they then, 25 or more citizens can petition, and then that starts the process. And then the township would be responsible for that cemetery afterwards. One thing I didn't mention, just so you understand too, on any of these cases, any money that is set aside, so if this was I'll call a true perpetual care cemetery, and say there was $250,000 in a trust fund, that also typically diverts to the township, municipality, whoever takes it over. Some states earmark it and say it has to be used for the maintenance and care of the cemetery. Other states don't say anything about it. So it's another interesting provision. Pennsylvania also, they have, everything goes through the Pennsylvania Real Estate Commission, so that's where their oversight is. And they also have another consumer protection group. It's not really consumer group, I take that back. It's called the PCCFA, so it's actually kind of a sister association of the ICCFA. So the ICCFA, and again, full disclosure, I serve as general counsel for them. That's the International Cemetery Cremation Funeral Association. We do have a division that allows consumers, if they have a problem with any cemetery in the country, they can notify us, and then we can try to resolve it. Pennsylvania does the same thing. The one thing that is made clear, there's no regulatory authority. In other words, we can listen to the issue, we can reach out to the cemetery and the consumer, we can suggest that something happens, but nobody has to follow it. But we have I know for ICCFA, we have a pretty good track record of resolving things. Maryland, again, their language is going to go to any burial site in need of repair or maintenance. So this is probably one of the most broadest ones because it isn't, it doesn't say neglect, it doesn't say abandoned, it's just need of repair. Any owner can request this. And cemeteries, a lot of times, again, this is a weird thing, all of the lot owners are the owners. So theoretically, anybody can do that. The other interesting about Maryland is that the county or municipal corporation, whoever has oversight, not only are they allowed to appropriate funds to try to help to fix, they also have in their law that they can ask for money. So that they can go out and try to raise funds and to gather that. And it's very unique because typically that's not what the city or state or anybody would ever do. They also have an oversight in Maryland, and that's the Office of Cemetery Oversight. So they have a regulatory board as well that helps in these situations. Virginia. Virginia, their law, again, it's abandoned, neglect, unused, so it's a little broader as well. The one thing that also is difficult here, theirs is taken by eminent domain. And the only reason I point that out, if you've ever dealt with that, any type of eminent domain case is not an easy case. It's hard to get a city when it says you shall take over to take over. But to get them to file an eminent domain claim and actually have that go through, it's very difficult. So there's I think, a tough thing. However, the one thing they also did a carve out is that the locality, if they are going to help or overtake a cemetery for any of those reasons, they don't have to take the whole thing. They can just take out a portion of it. So sometimes if a cemetery, there's a few bad sections or maybe part of it, they can handle it that way. Go back to that USA Today, the article was all about how to handle these tragic, climate change, talk about flooding cemeteries. And one of the things they talked about is, one, moving graves. The other one is allowing them to flood, depending on the section of the cemetery. But the other thing they brought up, and that's why this is interesting, is to move a grave is no easy task as well. Like we just kind of talked about this. You get into all sorts of rights of owners versus rights of the legal next of kin. So even though it seems like, okay, we've had catastrophe and all these caskets have flooded, I see that one after hurricanes a lot of times. You want to go and say, well, let's just fix it. The problem is almost every state, if you're lucky, they have rules and regs on how to handle this. But this becomes disinterment law, which is a very odd area of law in the U.S. in any state, because you have to typically deal with at least two people. You have to deal with the owner of the grave space, but then also the legal next of kin, whoever's buried. And many times they're not the same people. And if you can imagine, when you don't have the same people, fights ensue. So a lot of times the landowner's like, I don't want that to happen. Legal next of kin says, no, I want this to happen. And it causes us to go to court quite a bit, even for all good intentions. I'm sure you're well aware of that. Good intentions don't mean you get to, yeah, okay, you know that one. Tennessee, last one I think I'm going to give you right here is dilapidated, neglect, and abandoned, unsuitable for its use, which is, again, a nice broader term, I think, that allows a lot more to be happen. Theirs also is broadly written because they talk about the legislative body wherever it's located. And again, that seems like it wouldn't be a big deal, but I can tell you from other states that if the law says township and it's not in a township, nobody's stepping up. Where this is kind of like, we don't care where it is, municipality, city, whatever that legislative body is, wherever it sits, they're responsible. So anyway, that's kind of surrounding how that's being handled of any kind of abandon, neglect, any of those cases. I put in here just so you have, this is kind of basically all of the West Virginia law out there for the most part, 90%. You have different provisions. This is not unlike a lot of states. You have a scattering of cemetery laws in different areas. And these are no particular order, but I will tell you the second one, your West Virginia Code, Section 35.5, there's three parts to it, 1A, 1B. That's where the heavy lifting is of, I'll say, your cemetery laws. Protection of historic, I just happened to put that one up above. Oddly enough, that has more bite, but it's only applying to a cemetery that has historical significance. And you've actually had some cases in West Virginia challenging that. So that's out there. Disinterments are under your West Virginia Code 61, again, in a little different section. And it's focusing mostly on criminal, not necessarily the process of how to do it. And then removal of grave sites, access to cemeteries on private land is another area you have. Interment and disinterment permit process. And then this last one, West Virginia, your code 812.5, the governing body may acquire any cemeteries already established. That's about all I could find that kind of would be close. The thing is, it doesn't have a reason or rationale. It just says that they may. I mean, you could make the argument that if they wanted to go in to help a cemetery in disrepair, that the governing body could. But again, that's not what I typically see happening. Like, in other words, normally locality, they're not going out there saying, hey, we need to take this cemetery to fix it up. It's normally the flip where people that are the consumer base, right? The biggest thing, take the trustees out, take the companies out, it's consumers. Consumers that have families that are in a bad cemetery or cemetery that's been damaged, they're the ones that normally step forward and say, somebody needs to fix this. And then if the owner isn't there anymore of the cemetery, then it just keeps going down the line. They're the ones that push the hardest. I get tons of calls from consumers saying, how do I get this fixed? How do I get my lawn moved? Or how do I get them to cut the grass? Or, you know, if there's a flood, how do we find them? And so that's where a lot of this comes in. Where do people get help? So one is state, local government, we talked about it. But let's be very clear, those are normally kind of the worst case scenarios. Those are when everything else has gone bad, that state and local typically either have to step up or are asked to step up. Prior to that, you know, we have other things. We have insurance. You know, one of the things I deal with is working with cemeteries, making sure that they have proper insurance for things they didn't really think about in the past. You know, they didn't think about flooding and caskets being washed off of their property. But even when they do, a lot of times if it's from a neighboring property, I dealt with a cemetery that also had a landslide, but it was from the neighboring property and they couldn't get that property to have insurance to cover it. So they were out. But insurance is one. Local grants, federal grants, they are out there. There's not much. You know, most of the grants that I see are thousands of dollars that are available. And when you're dealing with a catastrophe, you know, you're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars that you need to make available that's just not typically out there. I don't have this on here, but when we are talking about natural disasters, a lot of times FEMA will set aside and provide money for natural disasters. The problem is that it's got to be a federal natural disaster typically for FEMA to step in. You could have state as well, and that could be another option, but a lot of times states don't, nobody thinks about the cemetery. But it's another area that you might, you can always look at. We have volunteer groups. That's probably the number one for a cemetery that is no longer, I'll say, functioning, or if it's in disrepair. There are volunteer groups out there. Boy Scouts are classics for coming in and trying to clean up a cemetery, make it an Eagle Scout project. That does happen. But even the volunteer groups are limited. And then the other one I'll share is other buyers. There are a lot of big cemetery companies out there. In my background, one of the companies I worked for, I was corporate counsel for a while at a group called Alderwoods. Jamie Foxx, if you've seen that movie about the burial, that's all about Alderwoods where I worked. So if you're bored, go watch that on Amazon. But anyway, I was corporate counsel. We had 750 cemeteries that we maintained all through North America. And there are large cemetery providers that can be also resources. But there's a reason they're hard to get, and there's a reason volunteer groups are hard to get. And this is the last thing I'll kind of leave you with. It's liability. Cemeteries are a very odd asset. They're a very odd business model. And it is because of this. The liability typically runs with the cemetery also in perpetuity. Meaning when I go in and I buy a cemetery, and this happens quite a bit, you know, and now it's mine, if we find, let's say, a wrongful burial. So mom was supposed to be in spot X, and oh, she's accidentally in Y. That family has a right to sue a lot of times. Well, they're not going to go after the owner 1, 2, or 3 before. They'll come after the current owner. And as much as we try, normally those are never able to be written out of a contract. We can't get rid of them, even if it's an asset purchase. Fast forward. One of the problems we have right now, we have small cemeteries that are just run out, or we have neglected, or we have damaged cemeteries that the current owners, it's too much for them. And then what they do is say, well, can somebody else come in and take it over? Can somebody buy it? Because we know the city or the state, they don't want it. And the problem is that these companies are like, we would love to, but we're not. because if we take it, now we assume all of your mistakes that you may have made and not even know about. One of the things that I've talked about is the statute of repose for cemeteries. Not all the time, not just because you change owners, but because of maybe neglect or damage, so that somebody could come in and say, and just so we're all clear, statute of limitations typically limit how long you can file a suit. Statute of repose, they talk about when you are free from liability. So basically, for a cemetery, if they came in and said, we will take over this cemetery that's either so badly damaged, we will put in the $1 million, we will fix it, we will take over this where all the pre-need money was stolen. There are groups that would be willing to do it if there was protection, like a statute of repose that says after maybe the state says, hey, this cemetery, because of X, Y, Z, we move on, and they'd be protected. I think a lot of states would see larger buyers willing to come in to help fix and take care of some of these situations. The problem is when they have to assume all of that old liability, that's where it gets really scary. And that keeps a lot of people out of the cemetery market, especially just to help. I think I went a half an hour. Hopefully that was all right.
Mr. Lemaster, thank
Yes.
you for that interesting presentation. Normally, we have time, you're only presenter, so we'll take questions.
Yep.
Maybe members of the House of Delegates or Senate who have questions. And I think given the way we're configured here, what I'm gonna do is hand to you the power of recognition. So delegates or senators who may have a question will just raise their hand and I'll let you take them in turn.
All right, I saw your hand first, sir.
All right. I live near a state park named Clint Falls. In that park, there are 6 cemeteries, 2 of which still belong to the families. They're in holding. But the other 4 belong now to the state of West Virginia. What's the liability of that state park or the state to maintain those cemeteries? Is there anything covering that?
So again, I didn't do a deep dive on all liability. I mean, you're going to have some, protection as a state already. And what I would say is normally once a cemetery has, I'll say, finished its inventory, which it sounds like these would be, really all we're doing is maintaining it. So as long as that's happening, the families, to be no issue. Now, if these are cemeteries where we still had family access and burials, that's a whole different item. But I would sit here and tell you, just to have a cemetery and actually to be in a state park where they're being maintained, it's probably the safest place it could be. Yeah, that's a great way to do it. And it would probably be covered then under that historic prevention code that you have in West Virginia. So it would be duly protected.
Yeah, these are probably the 4 that belong to the state. I'm sure the state assumed that no one would be buried there again, but I happened to be on site one time when the superintendent said, these people are driving out here to bury someone in that cemetery. We own it. And I said, well, you're a braver man than me if you're going to go up to those family members and tell them they got to pull back out and can't bury them here. So they did. They allowed them, which was probably not a good precedent to set.
There's a probably point where they should probably cap. So one of the things going on, cemeteries, I joke about this, and if you don't know me, I have an odd way. I try to have fun with some very dry subjects. I mean, no offense, but cemetery law and funeral law are not like, a lot of riveting stuff. So I try to have fun when I can. But one of the things that cemeteries did years ago is they created what's called a second right of interment. And that's where they allow somebody to be buried on top of somebody who was already there. So normally it's an urn. And then some cemeteries, I played this game when I said, how many of you do second rights of room full of cemeteries? They're like, oh yeah, we just started that. I said, anybody do a third right? I'll get a few. I'll go 4, 5, 6. And I've had people that will bury up to 10 urns on one grave. Now, this is all well and good, but what it does is it creates this perpetual liability now, because now all of a sudden we're allowing family to come in and say, hey, we're still going to keep using it. So for older cemeteries, one of the things I recommend is that they cap it, put an end to it, say it's only good for one generation or two, and then that prevents cemeteries like that from being accessed in the future, because that is a risk. Yes, sir.
Who reviews on the front end the economics work in one cemetery? In other words, where's the accountability for those folks who decided to go into the cemetery business
So,
and had economics which didn't meet the perpetual necessity of what we expect?
yeah, so let's talk in specific. So a lot of states have a process, and make sure I'm answering it right, where they have to submit an application to either start a new, which doesn't happen often, although I see more and more new cemeteries popping up right now, or to take over a cemetery, they do a review, they do an audit, they look at the perpetual care, they look at how much money is in there, they look at the people that are going to take it over and run it. That happens. My understanding in West Virginia is only thing gets reported is to the Department of Taxation. There's no regulatory board. So I do believe in West Virginia, if I wanted to buy and sell a cemetery, I would just do it.
And then just flip side, the liability side.
Yep.
Those folks who, I'd argue, irresponsibly go into the business of cemetery, provide that level of trust to consumers, right, folks who've lost loved ones. Have you seen any cases in other states or West Virginia in which we hold those folks who form these ventures
Yes.
accountable?
Yeah. Probably one of the biggest ones was up in Illinois, and there was a cemetery there. This is going back about 15 years, and that owner basically, I forget the number now, it was about $15 million that was siphoned off of the cemetery, including trust funds, merchandise trust, all that. And they went after them individually, for sure, and they ended up imposing a whole new set of regulations in Illinois because of that. Burr Cemetery it was Burr Oak Cemetery scandal, and it was pretty bad. But yeah, absolutely, I deal with it. I probably handle one or two a year, all over the place. But sadly, there are people that take money, and hopefully there is oversight in the cities. I'm dealing with one now in Kentucky, and unfortunately, Kentucky, it's only the AG's office that handles it. And sadly, I can tell you, the AG is not really that worried about, what's kind of a small amount of money in some little cemetery. So it's hard to get it to move. Yes.
So first, thank you very much for being here today.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Mr. Lemasters didn't say that he's also from West Virginia.
Yeah, I thank you. This was kind of, I appreciate you having me here, and it was kind of fun to come back home to be able to talk to you. I kind of moved and, went to mortuary school in Cincinnati, and then they just kept me there.
We're happy to have you back. And to the members, a little background. I asked for this topic we put on the district that I share with Senator Chapman as well as Delegate Fluharty. We had an instance back in April where a massive hillslide after a torrential rain, you were talking about rain, caused the destruction of probably 200 to 250 headstones, moved the caskets. I mean, it's really a mess in that area. And there was really, there's a volunteer group of trustees that have supervision over that cemetery, and they're completely lost in what to do. And the state came in and we provided them with some funding, but really what we found, there's no true way to, and there are other issues, just the cemetery just trying to cut the grass every year. So I brought Mr. Masters in and had this put on just to try to figure out what we may be able to do. And so as you looked over, and thank you for providing kind of the statutory authorities here in West Virginia, what do you think are our largest or most glaring omissions from law at this point in time?
If I had to pick two, one is I don't really see any easy mechanism for anybody to take over a cemetery that's in disrepair. Obviously, anybody could say, hey, we're going to do it, but that normally doesn't work. So I don't see really a mechanism at all for, again, neglect, disrepair, all that. And the other thing is there's not really, and I'm not one for a ton of oversight, but, I don't see go back to your trustees. I don't see where your trustees turn to to get the resources or support to figure out even where to begin to fix it. You do have, I think, a pretty active, it's the West Virginia, there's a couple associations. This specifically is the Funeral and Cemetery Association, which is kind of a mix, because you also have a West Virginia Funeral Board and Funeral Association, different, and they seem to be pretty active, and you know, that could be good. I'm all about self-monitoring. If it works, it's fine, but anyway, those would be the two that I would see. Yeah. You,
Three questions, I'll be short. So one is, are there any states that have regulatory or statutory schemes that allow for, require like an annual accounting or auditing of endowments so that you see a financial problem coming before it actually happens? The second question is, I see that a lot of these places allow transfer of title to a municipality or city. What happens if a cemetery is not within a municipality or a city, for example? I guess the county take it over, or the state responsibility in those other places? And then, what was the close to?
okay, good. I have to, no, I'm just kidding.
Well, actually, let me give it it's
Yeah, yeah.
with the statute of repose, I can see good intentions with that, but that also, the flip side, I think it incentivizes bad conduct. For example, so places that allow for a statute of repose, do they require a new owner or purchaser to put a certain amount of resources into the property they're going to buy in exchange for that protection?
Yeah, so first, be very clear, statute of repose, as of right now, I don't know another state that does it for cemeteries. I just believe it's something that I foresee that could happen. I think if you wrote it, I think it would have to be very specific that it would be only in certain circumstances, and I think the state would have to approve it. Yeah, maybe they put money in and take it over. I just had somebody take over a cemetery basically for $1, only because they had to put $500,000 into the endowment care because it was all taken. And the problem with that is, as much as we wanted the state to say, hey, you're good, we also know that they have potential for lawsuits. So that's why it's a tough thing. To yours, the first question on the audits. There are a few states, normally there's a filing of most states that you have to, you know, submit. And then a lot of states, not a lot, there are many states that also, if there's a transfer, they would require an audit. But overall, yeah, that's a general thing. And I think there's an annual report. I don't know how detailed it is in West Virginia, but for tax purposes. And then the second one was the,
It's about what, if there's not, you have examples of transfers of ownership to local governments, for example,
Yeah.
municipalities.
if it's,
Cemetery is not located within a city or town.
yeah, so I'll give you Ohio. If it's not in a township, nobody wants it, and we can't find anybody. So, yeah, if it says township, they're like, that's not ours. And it's not in a township, then nothing ever happens. Normally then, my best luck I've ever had is to get somebody like maybe a local funeral home or another cemetery to take it over for them, and then we try to work with the state to limit what we can. Yeah.
So what are the responsibilities of a property owner that has a cemetery on their property? Maybe it's not their family's, but they somehow acquired that property and there is a cemetery on it, or lo and behold, I'm cutting down trees and, oh, a cemetery.
Yeah. Short answer, none. So they're exempt. So they don't have to do anything. They don't have to provide maintenance. They don't have to have any endowment care money. They can do whatever they want. Now, what I always tell people, because I have people ask is, can I start my cemetery on my land? I said, arguably, depending on the state, sure you can. My question is why? Like, do you never want to sell this land again? Because nobody typically wants to buy a cemetery. There's no movie out there, hey, we just bought a cemetery. Like, that's not a thing anybody's after. And it is a huge liability on private land. So, but no regs. And that's normal in most states. Now, some states make it harder to create a private cemetery. Some are easier.
Thank you.
Yep.
So based on the review of the statutes, it appears to me that there's a wide diversity of types of statutes.
Yes.
Is there anybody who's working on any kind of model legislation of any sort, or would you recommend that?
Oddly enough, so ICCFA, we just tasked this year to update all of our model guidelines. And I believe ICCFA, we are going to create a model guideline for abandoned cemeteries because, again, while this is great for me, and by the way, when the attorney says it's great for me, normally there's something really bad. And the really bad part is that every state is different. Every state's interpreted different. Some are great, some are horrible, and it just allows for so much controversy. So yeah, I think if there was a model guideline that was kind of, and nobody talks about quote unquote damage as in natural disaster. That's just not anywhere right now, and I think it should be.
Elliot Cup from Falling Waters, West Virginia. I have two questions. One has to do with exempt cemeteries. From personal experience, my family and also me have some burial plots in Pennsylvania that's run by the Old Brethren, Church of the Brethren. The cemetery's over 100 years old. And when I got the deed for my plots, it was curious to me that it said only white people can be buried here. And I was just wondering, how far this exemption goes.
It kind of goes forever. So one of the things I do is I rewrite cemetery rules and regs, and sadly I've seen that in some old ones, and obviously it should be updated and changed, but the exemption can run forever. I mean, once it's exempt, nobody wants to take it back. That's part of the problem, is once you have an exempt cemetery, it's out. And then if you do try to pull it back in, the problem is now you're under all these new perpetual care, which you won't have any. I think the state, Ohio, or West Virginia, I think you have to start off with $10,000. That's the corpus. That's what you have to start with. Honestly, that's not.
That's really good. Yeah, the other question I had is just a general question, because I just have personal curiosity.
Sure.
Other than a religious preference or personal preference, what's the pros and cons versus cremation and burial?
Boy, don't get me started. But here's the other underlying thing. So I don't know that there really is I'll say any other preference. We are in a society now, though. Again, I do teach a lot of cremation programs, so give me 2 minutes. Cremation is by far becoming the most acceptable personal choice of final disposition. I believe it has to do with ease and cost, because we live in a very death phobia state. We don't want to talk about death, we don't want to handle it. So if there's a way I can handle a funeral almost over the phone and it only costs me $500, I'm going to pick it. Now, add that to what we're doing today. One of the problems cemeteries also have is, funeral homes, they have reduced revenue because cremation doesn't cost as much. Cemeteries are losing families. You don't have to bury a set of cremated remains. So what happens is cemeteries are literally just disappearing because no choice. Go back to the municipalities, counties, whatever. One of the interesting things that I see happening is most states have what are called indigent burial programs. And that is, the family doesn't have any money, so the county, city, whoever has to take care of it. Those programs, though, they don't realize what they're doing because they're really not indigent burial programs anymore. They're indigent cremation programs because it's cheaper for the city, the state, or whoever to do it that way. The problem is they're actually harming themselves because by not burying, they're actually harming the cemeteries that they now may have to take over one day because nobody's using them. It's really a kind of a vicious cycle that if they actually created an indigent program that used the cemeteries that are in their municipality, long term, they'll build a better program. Sorry, I got on the soapbox there. I'm going to get down. You're welcome. Yes, sir.
Just a quick, why statute of repose instead of limitation?
The problem with statute of limitations is it doesn't start until they find the mistake. So if a family comes back and they find out mom was buried in the wrong spot, 50 years from now, the statute of limitations won't run until they find it. Statute of repose says, look, once I take over this cemetery, because of all that, you can't file those claims against me. Again, I know it's a balancing act, but that's why.
But it could run before the
No, I mean, typically a good attorney will always be able to fight a statute of limitation saying, we just found the error, so now the claim begins. Yeah. Yes, sir.
A couple quick questions. Is there an inventory of the cemeteries in the state of West Virginia?
As in how many?
No, list of like quantity, the name, the location, and total number as well.
No. So it's another project we're doing. Most states do not have a total track of cemeteries in there, and it's partly because there are more exempt cemeteries in most states than not exempt. Because, say that again? So exempt means that they don't have to register, they don't have to follow any regulations, they can do what they want. And if you just think about all the churches in West Virginia that have a little cemetery, none of those are regulated. And it's not a bad thing, I'm just saying, but that's why it's really hard to have a count on how many are out there.
My second question is kind of related to what you just said. In my area in Appalachia, and I don't know if you've heard this or not, but a local church will have memorial services at about, in my area, about 10 different cemeteries. And it's like a traveling church service, and they do it annually. And all the descendants of the people that are buried there will attend the church service, and they have food on the ground and singing in church service. And it's kind of kept my little family cemetery together. It's about an hour away from Blacktop, out in the middle of nowhere. And me and my fellow cousins keep the cemetery moved. Have you ever heard of that?
I mean, it sounds like a great program, and I love it. And it kind of falls under that volunteer group of doing things to really keep these cemeteries, flush and, and funded, because it's a very big task to keep a cemetery that really isn't doing much anymore, that statistically will be doing less because of cremation, to keep them to have funds to be able to maintain just the basics.
It's a great program. It's an excuse for my family members, I mean, some of them really distant, to get together once a year.
That's fantastic. I love it.
All right, we're coming up on our hour. Mr. Masters, thank you so much. I will point out to everybody that his contact information is with his bio on the last page. So if you think of a question you wanted to ask later, I'm sure that you could reach out to Mr. LeMasters.
Always
Let me
available.
ask Committee Council, do we have a quorum assembled? We have quorum assembled, so I'll recognize the co-chair for a motion regarding minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we accept the minutes from the August 26th, 2024 meeting.
Questions on the motion by the co-chair for approval of the previous minutes? Is there discussion on the motion? If not, all in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye. All right. Point of personal privilege. This is a little bit of House of Delegates history. I mentioned when we introduced Mr. LeMasters that he's only the second person I've ever met who was a funeral director, embalmer, and an attorney. The first one that I ever met was a member of the West Virginia House of Delegates. He was a wonderful guy named Bill Wallace from Sam Black Church in Greenbrier County. And Bill used to say to me, "Charlie, your tie's messed up. I'll fix it for you, but you gotta lie down on your back on the desk, because that's the only way I know how to do it." Occasionally. All right. Any other business to come before the joint committee? I'll recognize the co-chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move we adjourn.
Questions on adjournment? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. We're adjourned. Thank you, and let me express our thanks and appreciation to the Parkersburg City Council for allowing us the use of this facility, this room. Yeah. Say, I'll fix it for you.